Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Solbeck-Swan. I'm the Executive Director of RARE, and I'm broadcasting tonight from the lovely city of Kitchener. As a fairly recent arrival to Canada, I consider myself a guest in this territory. The RARE Charitable Research Reserve acknowledges and is grateful to all of the original stewards of the land on which RARE resides within the Haldimand Tract, spanning 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from source to mouth. Understanding that this land has been rich in diverse Indigenous presence since time immemorial, there are several Indigenous nations that we would like to mention. We would like to honor and respect the sovereignty of both First Nations in our area, the Haudenosaunee people of the 6 Nations of the Grand River, and the Anishinaabe people of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Yahweh and Miigwech to these nations who share their lands with us. We would also like to acknowledge the neutral peoples and their ancestors and the indigenous paleo hunters who resided on these lands as long ago as 10,500 years. I would also like to acknowledge those indigenous peoples who currently live, work, and learn in the urban landscape around us, such as other self-identified and status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. As an organization that is committed to reconciliation with all indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, we recognize that our land acknowledgement really is only a first step in a process of healing and building better relationships with one another and the land and the waters. And we will continue to honor our commitment to reconciliation through staff and volunteer cultural competency training, the creation of meaningful and systemic policy amendments that accommodate Indigenous guests and employees at RARE, creating Indigenous knowledge, truthful histories, and understanding of local treaty rights and responsibilities into our programs, and creating opportunities for Indigenous engagement. I'm very happy to welcome everyone here today to RARE's third conversation for conservation. We are very pleased that you have joined us. Many of you I know are here for the third time today. And I can't think of a better day to spend with all of you, because today we are celebrating Earth Day, which I'm sure you know is a day to demonstrate support for environmental protection, which we do every day at RARE, but it's always fun to come together and to really celebrate this. So if you are familiar with the Conversation for Conservation events, you know we have a film screening with each event. And The Pollinators, which is the movie that is kind of on tap today here, has been available since Sunday and will be available until April 25th. So if you have not yet watched the film, I invite you to do that in the coming days. It is a lovely addition to the topic that we are discussing tonight. And tonight we are actually welcoming Dr. Tom Woodcock, who is a planning ecologist at RARE, as our special guest and speaker. And we are very pleased to be able to offer these important conversations and films as a way to really connect with each other during this pandemic, and also as a nice way to, as a larger group, connect with nature, even from the inside and the privacy and comfort of our own homes during yet another lockdown, unfortunately. So today on Earth Day is really the perfect day to do this together until we can gather outside again and catch up on all the garbage pickups and other things that we would typically do today. So a special thank you tonight is going to Quiet Nature, who is the presenting sponsor for tonight's event. Quiet Nature is a landscaping company based in Ayr that not only delivers beautiful landscaping, but also focuses on sustainability. They use innovative methods and materials to take an approach to landscaping that really considers the environment. And Quiet Nature has also done beautiful work at RARE before, and we are very pleased to have them supporting this special Earth Day event. Thank you so much for your contribution. And we would also like to thank our friends and partners as Musageddis, who also promoted this event as part of the Arts Everywhere Festival. And I think there's more exciting events coming up as part of that, so please check their website at artseverywhere.ca as well. So now I will finally turn things over to Tom, and we will have some time after the presentation for some questions. So don't feel shy to please type your questions in the Q&A box. Please use that over the chat window, and we will have a look at them after the presentation is over and really continue the conversation with you. Welcome, Tom.
Hello, thank you very much, Stephanie. Let me share my screen here so everybody can see. Thank you very much, and happy Earth Day to everyone. I'm going to talk tonight about pollinators and pollination, which is a very important environmental issue and becoming more and more important as time goes on. I'm hoping that everybody had a chance to see the movie, The Pollinators, which covers a lot of material and doesn't cover a lot of material as well. So I'm hoping to fill in some of the additional topics related to pollinators and pollination and why they're important outside of our agricultural systems. They touched on numerous issues in the movie, and for those of you that have seen it, you know that in the initial part of the movie, they discussed honeybee pollination and really the challenges of agriculture at an industrial scale and scaling a ecological service such as pollination up to that industrial level. And that was done with honeybees, so they were the focus of the movie. But there was also many other environmental issues that were discussed that affect agriculture and also affect other sorts of habitats and systems, including climate change, of course, which is very much on everyone's mind. Habitat fragmentation, so the breaking of natural habitats into smaller pieces, and in addition to outright loss of different habitats, you can only do one thing on a piece of land at a time, and how this has led to biodiversity loss in agricultural systems, issues related to soil and nutrient management, and how the loss of decomposing organisms and soil organisms has led to some issues there. And of course, another big one is pesticides that are harming honeybees and are also harming all other insects in various ways. So when we looked at the beginning of the movie, talked about crops when they're in bloom and the enormous acreages of almonds. And when you have so many flowers that need pollination at once, obviously you need a larger labor force than is available. So the solution in industrial agriculture is to bring in honeybees. They're portable, they come in very large numbers, and even if they may not be the best pollinator for some particular crops, they make up for it in sheer numbers for the most part. And they did point out that native pollinators in these landscapes, where there is one sort of flower for a week or two or three, they don't have the resources to complete their life cycles. Even the shortest lived pollinator from adult to the time where it lays its eggs for the next season is 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, up to bumblebees, of course, and which can take an entire year, and honeybees, which are perennial. So what is the solution to supporting our native pollinators in agriculture? We discussed a number of habitat modifications, and what I want to move into tonight is talking about implications for non-agricultural systems. We still need pollinators to pollinate other plants, and if we're losing them due to mismanagement of the land, then what can we do to help out? But the first thing we should talk about when we're discussing anything is what exactly is pollination? I'm sure everybody has some memories of biology from high school or university, looking at pollen moving to the stigma, pollen being the male cells, moving to the stigma, and this is plant reproduction. So if you look at the center of a more or less typical flower there, zoomed in the image, the tentacles around the edge are the stamens, which bear the anthers, which have the pollen in them. So those are the yellow things. And then the structure in the middle with the light colored disc on top is the pistil. and the disc is the stigma. And the goal of pollination is very, very simple. We need to get pollen from the same species onto that stigma so that it can fertilize the ovules, which are located down at the bottom of the stigma. This will result in a seed. And as often happens in nature, when systems become more and more biodiverse, the process becomes more and more diverse. And studying pollination ecology today, there's a bewildering array of pollination systems and mating systems and breeding systems in the plants, pollinator life cycles, and so forth. So how did all of this start? Usually when we have an immobile organism, whether it's a plant on land or a sponge in the ocean or a coral or whatever, you need an external agent required to transport pollen between individuals or transport reproductive cells between individuals. So we need to use a fluid medium. In the ocean, it's seawater. On land, it's the atmosphere. So we need to have pollination by wind. And this system works pretty well in a lot of conditions. If you have large open areas where the wind can sweep across terrain such as grasslands, many grasses are wind pollinated, then the system can work quite well. When you have areas with only a few species, such as large stretches of our northern and boreal forests, wind pollination can work quite well. But what do you do in other areas? Deep in a forest, say in the undergrowth, where wind is never more than the tiniest breath of breeze, or where you have maybe in the tropics where there's so many different species crammed into a single area that the nearest individual of your species that you would have an opportunity to mate with might be yards or tens of yards, hundreds of yards away. You need a more efficient agent. And this is where the animals came in. Generally, plants require pollination to reproduce, and usually it's best to have pollen from a different individual. Plants do have more reproductive options than animals. They tend to suffer less from inbreeding. Sometimes they can fertilize themselves. Other plants don't develop from seed, they just clone themselves. Really, the list of different mating systems and breeding systems is endless. But what we usually need is for the pollen to fertilize that ovule, and this results in a seed. A fertilized seed is generally needed to stimulate the production of fruit tissue. And this is food. So pollination is directly related to the yield of crops. If we don't have those seeds, if we don't have those fruits, then we're not going to have the crop that we need to eat. They pointed out in the movie that staples, many of which are grasses, are wind pollinated. So wheat, rice, corn, barley, rye, oats, sorghum, millet, depending on what part of the world you're living in. These are grasses, these are wind pollinated, but staples are what provide our energy, the bulk of our diet. The diversity of our foods, which of course we enjoy, but also the diversity of nutrients that we need, are generally reliant on animal pollination. So there's the often repeated mantra that 1 in 3 bites of food thank a pollinator. Arguably, even a greater proportion of the nutrients that you get rely on animal pollination. So much for human needs for food. Pollination is about much more than food. It's a central ecological process. So what do I mean by that? Virtually every ecosystem on the planet, there's a couple of minor exceptions, rely on energy from the sun. So ecological processes are ultimately mediated by plants because they're the only ones that can capture energy from the sun. Using photosynthesis, they create carbohydrates and go from there. They produce biomass, they produce sugars, they produce all manner products from photosynthesis. Everything else is dependent on the plants capturing energy from the sun. So pollination is critical for sustainable populations of healthy plants. These are the foundations of productivity in the ecosystem. We've talked about seeds and fruits, but really any biomass that the plant produces is important in the ecosystem. The plants produce oxygen, they take up carbon dioxide, they play key roles in the water cycle, nutrient cycle, production of oxygen. Any of the ecosystem services are dependent on the plants. If you look at the plants after they've died, they decompose, they release their nutrients. These are dependent on, as well, on bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates to mediate these processes. All these processes together are really what allow us to live. These are what make ecosystems work. So because plants are central, we need to be able to have sustainable populations of those plants. We have a mutualistic relationship between pollinators and flowering plants. These are two major elements of biodiversity. Flowers lead to pollination, seeds and fruits, the next generation of plants, and food for animals. So where do we go from here? Mutualistic relationships don't mean specialized relationships. Pollinator-plant relationships are surprisingly generalized. This varies by habitat and latitude. And around the world, there are many different types of pollinators. You see in this poster here that was produced by a number of organizations several years ago. There's an awful lot of vertebrates in those pictures, in that picture. So you can see primates and marsupials and bats and several different kinds of birds. In our area, we really don't have too many vertebrates. We really have one hummingbird species in Ontario that is our only vertebrate pollinator. If you get into the tropics, there are a lot more examples. So most of our pollinators that we have here are insects. So if we think of the basic system of pollen being deposited on the stigma, fertilizing an ovule and leading to a seed and a fruit and so on, how did this come to be? When the first plants appeared in impossibly long time ago, of course they didn't have pollinators. They would have had to use the wind, similar to immobile organisms in the sea, using fluid medium of the seawater to transmit their reproductive cells. So if a plant were to be assisted in reproduction by an invertebrate, there weren't very many species of invertebrates on land at that time either, then they may gain an edge in evolution. So if we think of something maybe accidentally moving through a flower, no one really knows exactly what happened, but there are some possible situations that have been floated. One is that an invertebrate that was feeding on the living plant tissue, let's just say it was a beetle, but it could just as easily and probably more likely to have been a cockroach or even a millipede or something, chewing on the leaves of a plant. Maybe it starts chewing on the flowers, and maybe it's more attracted to the flowers for some reason. Perhaps the flowers taste different, and it starts seeking out the flowers and gets some of the reproductive cells, we can't call it pollen quite yet, and moves them to another flower. Or perhaps a flying insect discovers that the sticky surface of the stigma, which is designed to capture wind-blown pollen, maybe it has some sugars in it that contribute energy to the pollen, being able to grow down into the pistil and fertilize the ovules. it discovers that it likes that sugary fluid and begins seeking it out. So suddenly we have insects that are maybe going from flower to flower, drinking this fluid and inadvertently carrying pollen with them. However it happened, it was a strong selective situation. We had an evolutionary explosion. And of course, evolutionary explosions move very, very slowly. We're talking thousands of generations in all likelihood, but from several 100 million years ago to today is what has led to the great diversity of flowering plants and associated insects that we see, to the point where animal intervention is now necessary for the reproduction of a large majority of the flowering plants. About 78% in temperate zones, and even more than that worldwide, because it is more prevalent in the tropics. The next question we would have to answer is, what is a pollinator? A flower visitor is not necessarily the same thing as a pollinator. To be a pollinator, you have to actually deposit pollen of the appropriate species in the appropriate place to lead to fertilization. When all this biodiversity of plants and insects, there's really a bewildering array of strategies, tricks, cheating on both sides, coevolution, specialization, which has led to the wide diversity of pollinators and the wide diversity of floral forms that you see. Excuse me. So I'll discuss briefly both attractants and rewards. So attractants are the signals that a plant sends out to a pollinator that perhaps it should visit there. It might find something nice. Rewards are what it actually gets. Did the pollinator do a good job? Is the plant fertilized? That depends entirely on where the pollen was deposited and was it of the appropriate species. It's important to remember that ecologically, nobody's doing anybody any favors. Each party is acting in self-interest, and it's minimizing its energy that it expends on the system. So plants will be trying to get the pollination service for the minimum reward that they possibly can. And the pollinators or flower visitors will be trying to get the maximum reward that they possibly can, and never sparing a moment's thought for pollen deposition. Even those organisms that specifically collect pollen, like bees, they're collecting the pollen, but it's the pollen that incidentally brushes on their body that is actually leading to the pollination. In non-agricultural systems, many pollinators are bees, but many are not. The movie The Pollinators did discuss native bees in some degree. They stopped short of discussing any other pollinating insects. The European honeybee exists in North America and in many places around the world, South America, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and many different areas, because of its association with humans, both for honey and for pollination services. And as we saw, the worldwide bee industry. North America does not have native social bees with perennial colonies in the temperate zone. Many tens of thousands of years ago, before there were human inhabitants in North America, there is a native honeybee in the fossil record, but it did not seem to survive the last glacial period. The European honeybee itself is actually native, of course, to Europe, but also to Africa, the Middle East, and western parts of Asia. Eastern Asia and particularly southern and tropical Southeast Asia have several other species of honeybees, that is, bees in the same genus. And then there are also in South America and Africa and Central America and Australia, stingless bees, which have large social colonies. But here in temperate North America, we have our bumblebees, which may have colonies of a few hundred bees, but they're not perennial. Bumblebee colonies die out each year, and produce the next group of bees, similar to social insects like yellow jackets, which again are annual. Perennial wasps in this part of the world are really perennial colonial wasps in this part of the world are really limited to the ants, which can survive across multiple years, and of course are found in the same group as bees. Image here shows a honeybee dutifully working on a native plant, Joe Pyeweed, here on the rare property. So honeybees do definitely move out into native habitats, but it's important to remember that we aren't going to be able to solve pollination problems in non-agricultural habitats by transporting honeybees around. First of all, there's no money in it. Second of all, there's not enough bees. And third of all, those honeybees will really be taking away resources that might be able to be used, that would be able to be used by native bees. So the impact on the ecology of our native pollinators is suspect, how it is affected by honeybees in natural areas. And so really we do have to conserve our native pollinators if we're going to conserve pollination service in natural habitats. It's just a very small example of the diversity of Ontario bees. All of these photos were taken in our immediate area, and these are just some examples of the 6 families that are here. I do not, excuse me, have a photo of a melitid or oil gathering bee. I've never actually seen one alive, so I've never been able to take a photo of it. But these other families, and there are other families, additional families of bees that in other parts of the world that don't occur in Ontario. Excuse me. But these are ones that we can easily find in this area. A word to add about parasites. We also have parasites pretty much in all of those families that you just saw. There's 2 different types of parasites. They're found in many bee taxa. There's the kleptoparasites, which are those that steal resources from other bees, usually by sneaking into their nests and laying eggs on the material that they've collected for their own young. So their egg will hatch, eat their host's egg and the provisions as well, and then hatch out of the nest. Or brood parasites, which are parasites of social insects such as bumblebees. Most of our abundant bumblebees have another bumblebee that is a brood parasite that will sneak in and take over the colony and basically trick the workers in that colony into raising its own offspring instead of the original queens. I bring these up because parasitic bees like this nomada here, happily feeding on a female willow catkin, are indicators of a healthy native host population. If we have sufficient hosts to support this sustainable population of parasites, then the host population is arguably healthy as well, can support that extra trophic level. If we had to choose a second most significant pollinator, it would have to be the flies, particularly the family Syrphidae or flower flies, which deserves a special mention because they do in fact feed on pollen. Many of them are also important in agricultural systems for another reason, in that they have predatory larvae, excuse me, that feed on small soft-bodied pests like aphids. But even though these syrphids are consuming pollen as their primary protein source, there are many other families of flower-visiting flies. Virtually any fly that feeds as an adult will go to flowers for nectar to satisfy its own energetic needs, and conceivably could lead to some incidental pollination. As a final group, as mentioned, the moths, butterflies, and beetles. These are less important here than they are in other parts of the world in terms of pollination service provided. Some of that, particularly with the moths, is probably due to lack of research. But the beetles will move around on flowers, usually feeding and making a mess that may cause some pollination. Moths and butterflies use their long mouth parts to sip nectar from flowers, and usually are a little more surgical in their pollination activities. So now that we know the players, how do we bring them together? The flowers are really advertisements. If you think of a wind-pollinated plant, the flowers really aren't visible at all. You wouldn't notice them. They're there. All flowering plants have flowers, but they're not conspicuous. They're not what we think of when we think of a flower. Flowers are saying, hey, here's your reward, hoping to attract the pollinator, the flower visitor, to execute the pollination service. And of course, it wants to attract the correct pollinator. If you think of this as a tavern, some customers are good. They come in, they behave themselves, they pay the bill, as in they deposit pollen in the appropriate place, and then they leave. Some customers are bad. They skip out on the bill, they trash the place, they steal the silverware. They generally make a mess. And those are not the pollinators that you want to attract to your flower. It should also be mentioned that some taverns are bad. Sometimes the plants are cheating as well. They advertise resources that they don't offer. They trick the pollinator in some way, up to and including what results in the death of the pollinator. For example, Jack in the Pulpit, local plant which many people are familiar with. It has a system where it attracts its pollinators to get the pollen on them, but then once it attracts them to the female phase of the flower, it doesn't let them out again. They just die in the bottom of that pitcher because they get trapped when they're delivering their pollen. Maybe the plant's getting some nutrition from that as well, but it seems relatively cruel. I've also included the picture on the bottom right. The yellow flower is actually mossy stonecrop, which is an invasive in this area, and it's just an indication that maybe this is like the large chain tavern that moves into town and puts the local pub out of business. In that it's attracting pollinators away from our native plants. There are really an innumerable number of different attractants, color and pattern. Patterns are often honey guides, so lines or streaks on the plant that direct the pollinator to a particular place. Different types of light. UV light can reflect different patterns that we can't see. Scent is a big attractant. Some flowers smell nice, some flowers don't. If a flower is trying to attract a a carrion fly, then it's going to smell like rotten meat. Flowers cheat. They offer rewards falsely. They they might mimic other flowers that offer rewards. Insects can cheat. They have rewards acquired without pollination. Different types of flowers. We have the open flowers, actinomorphic flowers, they're sometimes called. These are sort of the plain, open, bowl-shaped flowers that are open to everybody. And excuse me, they are generally have their resources quite accessible. Anybody can come along, whether they're large, much larger than the flower, like the flower visiting longhorn beetle on the left, or if they're smaller than the flower or the inflorescence in this case, because this is a sunflower, they can still easily access the resources. Now the opposite, and where we see more complexity in the flower is the zygomorphics. And these are tubular, sometimes called, or complex flowers, where they're not a simple open bowl, but where they're trying to guide a particular pollinator, or at least a particular size of pollinator, more precisely to deposit the pollen with more precision in the correct place. So there's many examples. Any flower that's not a plain open bowl has some sort of modification. The purple fringed orchid on the left will attract its pollinators, and it will deposit packets of pollen on their back. So when they visit the next flower, those packets of pollen will come directly in contact with exactly the right spot. If they are too small or too large, well, maybe that won't work properly. The bumblebee on the top right is visiting a legume flower, which is designed to very precisely deposit pollen on its underside that will come into contact with the stigma on the next flower that it visits. So great surgical precision in the design of the flower in actually controlling the pollinator's behavior. Placement of pollen is key. All visitors aren't equally effective. In this case, we have two flies of approximately the same size visiting hop tree flowers. They're both feeding on nectar on these male hop tree flowers. Hop trees have their male and female flowers on completely separate plants. So cross-pollination is the only way they can produce seed. You can see the fly on the left as it's feeding on the nectar produced by nectar-producing tissue. It's getting pollen all over its underside. So when it visits a female flower and feeds in the same way, that pollen is going to get rubbed all over the stigma. The fly on the right is landing on the petal, sticking its head between the stamens and not feeding at all. So it's not getting any pollen on its body. Now that we've attracted the organisms, we have to reward them. The two key rewards are nectar for nutrition. This is carbohydrate fuel for flight, lets them find more food, lets them feed their young. Pollen, of course, gives them protein. Body maintenance, again, feeding their young. There are many other types of rewards. There can be warmth, there can be finding of mates, there can be protection from the elements. There are bees that collect oils instead of nectar. There are orchid bees in the tropics that collect scent, actually collect the scent molecules and use those to attract females. Many different types of rewards. Predatory interactions probably are a negative on pollination success. You can see two crab spiders, one on a buttercup and one on a goldenrod, that have both captured pollen-laden bees that won't be delivering any pollen. And the interesting larva here is probably a syrphid larva. I don't know exactly what it is, but you can see it's on a flower and it's actually stuck pieces of petal onto its body as camouflage. So it's lurking on that flower, waiting for something. You can also find hosts, or you can find mates. The fly on the left-hand side is a conopid fly, and it actually waits on flowers for its host, which may be a bee, depending on the species. and it actually chases them down in the air and injects an egg into them, which hatches into a parasitic larva. So it's got sort of a little can opener on its abdomen that levers open a space between the abdominal segments and jams an egg in there. The the ambush bug on the right, see we have the female here in the center. She's impaled and is feeding on this mud dauber wasp, and she's also being mated with. So it's a good day for her. One final thing I'd like to talk about is heat. One final reward. Skunk cabbage is a local flower that can produce heat. There are also Arctic flowers that can offer heat as a reward. This is Dryas, or mountain avens, which is a very common northern plant in the Canadian Arctic. And it has parabolic and highly reflective flowers that concentrate heat right in the center. And you're a tiny cold-blooded organism in a cold climate. A few degrees can make a difference. So organisms are attracted to sit right there in the middle, right on the reproductive structures, and absorb a few extra degrees. And maybe that extra warmth helps the seed development too after it's been pollinated. The tiny fly on the bottom there show a sequence. He's not sitting in the middle. He's not touching the reproductive structures. Well, maybe he's cheating and getting nectar without actually doing the job. So if we want to conserve all of these ecological processes that offer life support, and by life support I'm referring to our own lives, we have to protect land, of course, protecting the biodiversity and the machinery that carries out these ecological processes. But there are also plenty of opportunities where we can make choices with our food habits, and we can also possibly even plant our own gardens in order to encourage pollinators and insect biodiversity as a whole. Pesticides, of course, are a big issue in genetically modified organisms. In the movie, they talked about GMOs and how it has led to, well, probably the biggest effect on invertebrates is the spraying of glyphosate, which removes all of the off-bloom resources that they might otherwise have been able to access. Throughout the movie, when we're thinking about what's happening to pollinators or honeybees, we also have to think that these are happening to all the other invertebrates as well. We're losing predators that might otherwise be protecting the crops. We're losing decomposers that are helping to maintain the soil in a healthy state, and so on. Beneficial insects, we can have parasites like the fellow down here, which looks like a two-headed aphid. This is the actual aphid's head, but this is a parasite that's emerging from its abdomen. It's been in there since it was an egg and hollowed it out into an empty husk. On the right-hand side, there's a predaceous stink bug, happily draining the fluid out of a caterpillar, which sort of looks like a half-inflated balloon at this point. These types of organisms could be working on protecting crops as well if the habitat was appropriate for them. So just a couple of things that you might be able to do on your own property to protect or encourage pollinators and other insects. Nesting habitat is often neglected. When we talk about pollinator conservation, people usually focus on the flowers, but what we really need is places for them to nest: sandy or bare soil, twigs, stems, dead wood, grasses or cavities, things that they can use to build their nest, which really varies widely depending on the species. Having plenty of different plants spanning the entire life cycle of pollinators, whether they're short-lived or long-lived like bumblebees. We want to encourage a variety of plants that flower in the early, mid, and late season. In addition to protecting our native flora and habitats at Rare, we do have the Savage Chamberlain Family Pollinator Conservatory located at Springbank Farm, which has several installations. We have a grove of pollinator-friendly trees, an orchard associated with the food bank, and several garden installations emphasizing different aspects of the pollinator community. And Rare's most recent initiative is the 1000 Gardens Project. So you can order a sign for your own garden and register your own garden. This project is just getting underway, and there's a link there at the bottom if you want to know more. And thank you very much for listening. I realize I went a bit over time there.
That was really great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for this really interesting presentation. I personally always like to see those pictures of the parasites and the predators, because I think they're really interesting and kind of cool in a creepy way, particularly the ones in the bug world. I do think we have a small handful of questions here. If anyone has any other questions, now is a good time to enter them in the Q&A window. So the first question is from Barbara, who is asking, do all flowers contain nectar glands?
Well, that's I would say that most flowers that are looking to attract a pollinator will in fact contain nectar glands of some description. So they're the nectar producing tissue will secrete the sugary substance, which of course provides the fuel for the insect. So there's quite a bit of variation. Some of them will only secrete that reward at a certain time of day or at a certain time in its life cycle. Some have very highly concentrated nectars, others have very weak nectars. Again, it depends what they can get away with in attracting the correct pollinators.
Great, thank you. We have another question also from Barbara, who is asking, can you suggest any perennial plants that grow well in shade as a ground cover and yet are pollinator food plants? Well, knowing that you're an avid woodland and prairie gardener, you probably have a good answer for this one too.
Yeah, shade is often difficult. There's actually some really great resources out there called Grow Me Instead, which will show, it'll show a sort of plant that's available at a nursery that may not be a native plant, for example. And then it will show a native plant that has a similar type of growth pattern or bloom color or habitat requirements like shade. So you're able to look into the appropriate plant for what you want to accomplish aesthetically in your garden. Oh, and I think Jenna has just posted a link in the chat box to those resources. Thank you, Jenna. I was going to try and do that, but I figured I'd just confuse myself trying to do that and talk at the same time. But yeah, if you're looking for shade plants, there's many woodland plants and small shrubs. I showed some of the orchids and the Dutchman's breeches in the talk. Right now we have bloodroot flowering. We'll have trilliums flowering soon. Some of the shade tolerant shrubs like swamp currants will be flowering, which are very popular with the pollinators.
Great. There's another question from John, who is asking, are any native plants being planted to predominantly attract bumblebees?
There are a few plants that are bumblebee specialists, I guess you would say. Things like turtlehead and bottle gentian are both bumblebee specialists in that they have tightly closed blossoms, and they require a very strong bee to open them, basically, and actually get in and get the reward. And they have a fairly large reward inside, a large volume of nectar. So if a bumblebee can manage to fight their way in there, then they get a big reward, and the plant is happy because it's attracted the pollinator that it wants. One of the key things for bumblebees, I think, is also making sure that there's forage available in the fall. So things like goldenrod and asters, when the bumblebee colony is at its largest and when they're producing next year's queens, reproductives. So it's really when their need for food is at the highest, is when you want to be able to provide some food for bumblebees.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions that came in here. One from Jim, who is asking, you mentioned nesting sites need more attention. I haven't found very much guidance for ground nesting bees compared to the non-ground nesters, such as small carpenter bees. Any advice on how to promote nests for sweat bees, for example?
The key thing for ground nesting bees is to have really not turf. Anything that will allow some open, bare soil amongst the plants that they can actually dig into. And that includes avoiding mulch in your garden. So if you pile a lot of mulch, that will discourage or keep out entirely the ground nesting bees. So sweat bees and miner bees, and some others will dig holes in the soil. But if you have even sort of a back corner of your garden out of sight, where you don't mind a bit of bare soil, that's probably the best thing that you can do to encourage them.
There's a follow-up where Jim is asking about what about compacted soil?
Compacted soil will have poor structure, so it will tend to discourage them. It's a bit of a balancing act with the bees and digging in the burrow, because they want the soil to be loose enough that they can move it easily, but not so loose that it collapses before they're ready. Of course, when they're done burrowing, they fill in the end of the burrow anyway, and then the young bee has to tunnel out. But they do want the cell itself to hold its shape, and they don't want to have to dig, put in too much effort or spend too much energy actually digging the burrow. So if they find that the soil is too hard and compacted, then they'll likely move on and look for something else.
Our next question is from very specific, because now he's asking, what pollinators have you seen on white-leafed spring beauty and bellwort?
Oh dear. I can't think of any specific. I know I have seen early season miner bees on bellwort. Spring beauty. Oh. Yeah, I can't think of answers for that. Sorry, John. It's a bit too specific for me.
That's okay. I think we have one last question from Taylor, and who's asking, is there any vegetables you can recommend for the garden that will attract bumblebees?
If you're planting in your vegetable garden, bumblebees will come to things like tomatoes and peppers. They're not especially rewarding for them, but they are used in commercial greenhouse production. Onions are very popular, really for a lot of bees if you let your onions flower, or some of your onions flower, and also a lot of the common herbs that you may have in your garden. Sage is a particularly good one, so we have native representatives, but something like oregano or basil will attract plenty of insects if you let it flower.
All right, there's one more question I think that is related to the movie and to something you shared during the presentation as well, which is Barbara is asking, is there a concern about too many honeybees eating up so much of the food supply for native bees?
That is definitely a concern. Honeybees are capable of doing an awful lot of work. You know, busy as a bee saying is really apt. They can visit, you know, if you start putting lots of honeybees in an area, like some of those bee yards that we saw, where they were stacking literally thousands of hives in a given area, off the trucks and whatnot, it's almost inevitable that they're going to be feeding on virtually all the food in the area. So yes, I think that's a major concern, and there have been studies which are surprisingly inconclusive. I think in a lot of systems there is almost more resources than there are pollinators. Like there's an excess of resources, and a lot of plants may not get visited, and a plant is very rarely fully pollinated, especially if it has a lot of flowers. So the question is not quite as simple as you might think, but yes, almost certainly they can outcompete a lot of the native pollinators and use up a lot of the resources.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. This was really interesting and informative, and I think this is about the amount of questions we can answer tonight. But I would like to ask you to stick around for a couple more minutes, because I have a few announcements, including the date for the next conversation, and also some more information on the 1000 Garden Challenge that Tom shared earlier. But for now, thank you so much, Tom, for giving this wonderful presentation here on Earth Day tonight. And we're very thankful and appreciative of everyone's really enthusiastic questions and participation. Really, really great. Thank you so much. So tonight is in fact a really big night for Rare, because it is not only Earth Day, it is also the deadline for our $30,000 fundraising goal that we started early this year. So alongside the Rare Board of Directors, we have been asking you to help us to turn the map green to protect local lands forever. And there's a lot at stake if we don't protect those sensitive green spaces. So, and while our event and film screening tonight here is free to remain accessible to all, we invite you that if you can, to contribute to protecting a little piece of Rare. And a donation of $5 to $20 from everyone who participated here today would really make a big difference for us to reach our ambitious goal. And I'm very happy to share that we are actually getting very close to meet our goal. And as of this afternoon, we had raised $25,114, which means already through this effort and through this series of conversations, we have protected 12,557 square meters of land. So thank you for that. That's really great to be able to share that here tonight. And thank you also again to Quiet Nature, whose contribution of $500 also went to this effort as the presenting sponsor for tonight. So we will also be sending out an email after the event, and we would love your feedback, which also includes a link to donate directly to protect the lands if you want to participate. And we can't wait to see how many square meters of land you actually can help us to conserve here tonight on Earth Day. So I would like to make sure and really recommend you sign up for our e-news for some more exciting events and other updates coming your way very soon. And the very next one is actually our next conversation for conservation, which will happen on May 26th. So mark that in your calendars. this time with Jenna Quinn presenting on tallgrass prairies. So this topic is especially exciting and really quite timely because many of you must have seen it in the news that 1 week ago we conducted our second prescribed burn at the tallgrass prairie at Rhea. So that's really another really interesting topic, and we hope you can all make it and join Jenna for that. And we also have a really nice giveaway coming up in the next couple of days of a special Mother's Day themed gift basket containing goods from all local female-owned businesses. So stay tuned for details on that giveaway, and you might be the lucky winner to actually receive the perfect Mother's Day gift, which is actually valued at over $500. And I've heard about some of the items that are part of this, and I can tell you we can all use a little bit of pampering these days, particularly those moms who are at home with the little ones due to yet another lockdown. So keep an eye out for that. And lastly tonight, as Tom had mentioned, we are officially launching a new initiative, which is the 1000 Gardens Project. So if you do have a pollinator garden at home, you can register your garden on this new webpage, and it will become part of the corridor showing or listing all green space with native plants that support bees, flies, butterflies, birds, and more from Waterloo region, Wellington County, reaching all the way to Toronto. So your garden can become part of the larger mosaic of habitat for pollinators in the area, whether it be your entire front yard or just a few pots and baskets you keep on your balcony. So thank you so much to one of our partners and the Corporation for Conservation, FIX, for their tremendous knowledge and guidance on making this project come alive on the website. So to continue to spread the word about this, we also have really nice lawn signs available for your garden, so you can pique your neighbors' interest and maybe spark your own conversations for conservation in your neighborhood about what's going on in your yard. I know I will sign up for it because I have a little pollinator garden too, and I'm really looking forward to get one of those signs on my lawn. So I think the link has already been shared to the webpage in the chat window. So if you want to look this up right away, you can do that there. And we would love to have you register and or reach out to learn more about this. So if you don't already have a garden, but you would like to create your own to be able to become part of this, make sure to purchase some plants at our upcoming spring plant sale, which is starting on April 29th. So that's very soon, next week. And this will also happen online. So you can purchase vegetable and flower seedlings and pick them up safely in May. So our friends at Reap, which many of you know, are also still selling bloom in boxes, which provide you with an all-in-one plant kit to support pollinators. And there are really so many other different ways we all can work together to support pollinators from our homes this year. And before you all sign off for the night, I also want to thank the staff who made this event happen, particularly Tamana Cohi behind the scenes as our tech support, and Laura Klein, who's doing a lot of the coordination around the 1000 Gardens initiative. And of course, Tom for his wonderful presentation here tonight. And also thank you very much to our board and the many other donors who helped us to get close to our goal of 30K to turn the map green. And if you enjoyed this event, we invite you to please help us get over that finishing line. And remember, even a $2 donation makes an impact here and protects the square meter of land at Rhea. And don't forget the movie. If you haven't watched it yet, The Pollinators is available to screen until Sunday evening. So happy Earth Day, everyone, and thank you very much and have a good night.